me ask you a question. Why isn't it sexist for the church to reserve holy orders, the priesthood, to men? I mean, that's the cry of the left. It's a sexist. Why isn't it sexist?
It really comes down to you have to maintain the thesis that just because men and women are both equally human, equally persons, equally Christians, when they're baptized, that does not mean or imply in any way that they have exactly the same role, function, jobs to do. You just have to maintain that equality as a human, equality as human persons does not mean sameness in roles, which is to say there is a legitimate place for gender roles, a role in society you generally uh, operate in based on which sex you are, whether you're male or female, which is to say men and women are actually different and are actually better, have different strengths and weaknesses. And so life works better if we do different things.
As they say, when I was a cop, stay in your lane. Stay in your lane. Guys, stay in your lane. Women, stay in your lane. That's the way we have an ordered society. You want disorder, like bumper cars? Guys, start acting like women. Women start acting like men. You'll have a disordered society, right?
Yep. Real fast.
So how does Saint Bonaventure weigh into this debate? What was the title? I know he's a doctor of the church. What do they call him? They don't call him they call Thomas Aquinas the angelic doctor, but Saint Bonaventure had another title. What's his title?
He's the seraphic doctor.
That's right, the seraphic doctor. Seraph, the highest order of angel. So he weighs into this debate. What would he say if he were here on the Terry and Jesse show, the hot seat?
So Bonaventure gives us two really good points. First, he really focuses on what I said earlier, that it's because Christ established it this way, and therefore we can't change it. That's the explanation the church ultimately came down on under JP2. Because Christ established it, the priesthood, that is, we can't change the nature of the priesthood. So he was the first one to really focus on that as the reason. But then he gives us a really good argument for the intelligibility, or how we can understand, how we can make sense of this teaching, of this reality of holy orders. And he says we have to focus on what the priest's role is in the Mass, because the priesthood is all about the Mass, as it turns out. Like Hebrews says, every high priest is appointed to offer sacrifices on behalf of men. The Mass is the sacrifice of the cross, the same sacrifice that Christ offered on Calvary. And so we have to focus on what the priest does in the Mass in order to understand then the nature of the priesthood, and therefore why it is that only men can do this.
You mentioned St. John Paul II. He did write something to this effect. When did he write it? It was like in the 90s. Didn't he give kind of a definitive teaching on this topic that women can't be ordained? What year did he write that, and what was it called? Do you know?
Yeah, that was Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, so the ordination of priest. I think it was 1994. Okay. It might have been a couple, plus or minus 2 years, but we'll say 94, plus or minus a couple years. And yeah, it's really short documents because he doesn't give really arguments, but he does give the definitive teaching. It's like, I declare as Pope that the church has no right, no power to ordain a woman. This is to be definitively held by all the faithful. It's no longer open for debates. This is the end. And then under his later on under his papacy, it became normal policy for bishops, if they were trying to ordain a woman, like they would go and pretend, say the rite of ordination over a woman and try to ordain her. And his standard policy was, you're all excommunicated. And that just became the standard practice. And eventually, under Ratzinger, they issued, under Pope Benedict, when he became Pope, they issued a new. They got tired of doing this every time a bishop tried to ordain a woman. They got tired of so often having to give the individual excommunications. It was just too much work. They just did a blanket statement: if you do this, you're automatically excommunicated. Just because so many people, especially in the United States and Europe, so many bishops were trying to ordain a woman. They would go and say the words, and the woman would run around saying, "I'm a priest." Or priestess, and of course it's false. And so under Benedict, they got so tired of doing this every couple months. If you do this, automatic excommunication. But JP2 started that, and that started under his papacy. Yeah, so he thought he tried to end the debate, but the feminists are strong.
Yeah, apparently, yeah. Old heresies are they're hard to die. Didn't Pope Paul VI, you would know since you did the study on this, Didn't he write something on this also called Inter Insignoris, like
Yes, exactly.
in
Yeah.
the 70s?
Yeah, that was I think 76, I believe,
Okay.
like plus or minus a couple years. Yeah,
Okay.
that wasn't him technically. That was the CDF, so the
Okay.
congregation under him. So he approved it, of course, in ordinance publication, but it was by the CDF under him. But yeah, that's a much lengthier document explaining the arguments about well, actually because Christ established us the priesthood this way, we can't change it, and things like that. But that's a much larger document.
So you've had two papal proclamations on this topic, and you still have modernist bishops that are doing their own thing, disregarding a CDF document under St. Pope Paul VI, and disregarding, was it an encyclical from John Paul II?
Might have been apostolic letter. It was something. Yeah.
Apostolic letter. Oh, in other words, these things have the weight of the papacy, where they've weighed down on this topic, and we still have rebellious children in the church.
Yeah, and after JP2 issued his proclamation a year later, the CDF came back and answered a question because bishops were like, "How authoritative is this? And how are we to understand this?" So CDF said this is infallible and part of the deposit of faith, which is to say a truth revealed by Christ. So it is infallible. The church is very, very clear. And the CDF later, a couple years later, used this teaching as an example of infallible teaching. The CDF wrote a commentary on the profession of faith, explaining what things you have to believe with faith, what things you're allowed to disagree with. And this teaching was an example of it's infallible. And so the magisterium is super, super clear.
Yeah, in other words, this case is closed. It's not open for discussion any longer. That's what
Not
I'm hearing you saying, right?
Very much so. Not at all open.
So how does the Mass help us to answer some of these questions about the male priesthood?
Yeah, it helps us because we understand what the priest's job is then,
Okay.
which is to say mass. The main job of the priest is to say mass. During last century, you had a bunch of modernist theologians who tried to separate the priesthood away from the mass and say, no, the priest is just a servant. The priest, Karl Rahner's idea was the priest is a man of the word. He's a preacher, which is to say a Protestant minister with a collar, right? But no, JP2 and the entire tradition of the church, and including Council of Trent, is very clear. The priest is to say mass. That's his main role. That's everything he does is points to the mass, which is, of course, Calvary, the sacrifice, the representation of Calvary.
Yeah, when you look at the definition, obviously, Old Testament priest, the book of Hebrews, it always connects the priesthood with the sacrifice, always.